as part of our detective work to find out for our documentary who was Orry-Kelly, what was his life like, what were his thoughts, what did he care about, what was it like working with the actresses. Right at the beginning, all the Hollywood film historians said to us, do you know that there is a rumour that Orry-Kelly wrote his memoir? And they have all been trying to find that memoir for 30 years. So Catherine Thompson, the writer, and I were like, we're going to find that memoir. We're definitely going to find it. And the rumour was that maybe a copy had been sent back to his family in Australia, maybe Anne Warner, who was his closest friend and who was with him when he died, perhaps she had it. And then, so the search was on. So we harangued all the archives, UCLA, USC, Warner's archive. No sign of the memoir anywhere. Deborah Nadoolman Landis had also been trying to find it. And we did a huge campaign in Australia. I was on Radio National. In the end, we had stories in the paper. We had a genealogist. Anyway, it was a giant search for this memoir. Now, as part of the frustration, as Catherine Thompson and I realised we were not getting any closer to finding it, but we found, as part of finding out about Orry, many clips and letters and things in the wonderful archives that they have for many of his friends, Hedda Hopper, Cole Porter, Marion Davies, and so on. So we were finding out lots of bits and pieces about Orry, but still at the back of our mind, we wanted this memoir. So Catherine finally decided, this is in the early days of the research, we still hadn't actually raised the money to make the film properly. She said, I've got friends, family that I want to visit in Texas. I will go on my own spend and I will turn up at those archives in Los Angeles and I'll play the I've come all the way from Australia card and hope that maybe they'll let me in, because even though we've had friendly relations, we've been emailing, and many of them have been very helpful, we just sort of felt like if we could only get in those back rooms ourselves. And Catherine felt if she could just beg to say, can I just have a look? There just could be a little box somewhere. So she did that, but I said, well, if you're going to contact the Warner's archive, perhaps we should use our friendship which had been developed over the last year with Anne Warner's daughter, Barbara Warner Howard, who lives in New York. And of course, the Warner family now no longer own Warner Brothers. It's owned by a big corporation, but they're still sort of considered royalty. So she's Jack and Anne's daughter. So we asked Barbara to write an email, a letter of introduction, to say this Australian writer, researcher, is turning up and she's in full support of the film. Please help her. And they're searching for the memoir. So 2 days before Catherine was to arrive in LA, I get an email from Barbara saying, Leith, the then head of the archive, he'd been the head of archives at Warner's for 40 years, thinks he may have found something, but he wants to tell you himself. And I'm like, oh my God, after all this time. So then an email arrives from Leith, and he says, I found an unmarked box in our archives that I think may belong to Orry, and I think it may have some objects of interest. Then there was a whole palaver from originally, great excitement. We're thinking, fantastic, and Catherine was going to get in there and write notes, and if the memoir was there, take notes from it. Then they did a sudden, we don't actually know who owns the copyright to the box and the objects in the box, so you can't take notes or photos. And this is the film that still hasn't been financed. You have to pay for a security guard to stand over Catherine and watch that she doesn't photograph, take notes, or steal anything. So luckily, another LA researcher just actually volunteered to go in. The two of them go in, and I'm waiting for the text saying from Catherine going, I've got it, it's there, or whatever. She finally, after this sort of 4-hour session, gets out, and she sends me a message and she says, well, it seems to be there are a lot of loose pages in there that are photocopy and they look like cut and paste of he's been editing this memoir, but they're all out of order. I try to read bits and pieces and, here and there. But she said the other thing in the box is there are a lot of drawings and there seem to be photos, and actually at the bottom of the box are his 3 Oscars. So we thought, well, somehow or other we've got to get to this, and whether or not we can somehow manage to put these pieces together for the memoir. But the key thing is, if there are actual costume drawings and personal photos, then we have to photograph them. So we realised, of course, the person who owns the copyright of the box would be Jack and Anne's daughter, Barbara, because basically Orry left the box to her. So months later, when I finally arrived in LA with the film crew, and by the way, by then we'd actually found the entire memoir in Australia, in a cupboard. That's another story. Complete fluke, and literally a week after we found the box in LA. So when I turn up 4 months later with a film crew, and Warners have agreed to allow me to film the objects in the box, and they've laid them out on the desk, what I realised when I looked at them is this is a man's life. These are the key things that his best friend saved when she went to pack up his apartment after he died too young. I mean, for me, it was really quite emotional, thinking, well, there's a picture of his dog, and, there's Robert's the boyfriend we'd read about in letters to George Cukor, and there are, yes, the beautiful costume designs for Irma la Douce and for Gypsy with the fabric pinned to them. But then there were other things, like there was a strangely long, you don't normally do costume drawings in that sort of long oblong shape, and there were these row houses, and I'm thinking, what film is that from? And, why are the figures sort of so tiny and distant? And then I thought, oh my God, it's Sydney, it's Woolloomooloo. It's where he played with the underworld in Sydney before, which we'd found out from the memoir, before he left for America. So there were all these pieces of his life, which we're allowed to film. And the thing that's wonderful is that ACMI were allowed to bring those pieces and put them here in the exhibition. And whenever I look at them, and it's incredible to see them, because the day I was filming, it was like mad, like, here's one, roll, here's one, to actually now walk and contemplatively look at that, beautiful design for Gypsy with the fabric, and look at the dress for Jane Fonda. If you look really closely, you can see there's tiny little eyes painted. They look like spots from a distance, and that's, he was obviously playing with the whole theme that he, 20 years earlier, had done the extreme dress with the giant eyes in the Dolly Sisters. To be able to stand there and look at that detail, but at the same time think this was nearly lost forever. I mean, the Warners Archive is not, as people imagine, some wonderful museum where people can come and look. It is just a warehouse in the valley, over the other, the downside of Hollywood, and I didn't even see, where their boxes are. But they're not there for the public. And to think that if we hadn't been pushing and pushing and pushing, and finally, really, if Catherine Thompson hadn't said, well, I'm turning up, I don't think that box would ever have been found. And I would imagine, now that these studios are run by big corporations who really don't care about the history anymore, and to them it was so long ago, and maybe Casablanca or something, but half those films that Orry worked on, nobody would care, and no one would care about him. And I just think in another 10 years, they'd say, oh, let's sell the land where that archive is. We'll give a couple of boxes to the Academy and the rest would have been dumped. And it would have been actually lost forever. So, and the Oscars, we had to polish them to shoot them and try to put them on a bit of velvet. So that was the other thing for me, to walk into the exhibition in ACMI and to see them. They've actually been restored. And there they are all properly lit and in a row. And I just think it's such a symbol of Orry and of his work and of his status as an incredible artist. Finding the memoir when we'd absolutely given up and we'd written a script and we're about to make the movie was mind-blowing. And mind-blowing that it was so random. I mean, just completely unbelievable. So, yeah, we look everywhere. We have genealogists. We're calling family members. They say it's with this side of the family, not that side. We've got the name of a male cousin. I'm on Radio National, in the newspaper, looking for him. And our family have said that they haven't heard from him for years. Obviously, he'd left the country. So we finally gave up. Then I was invited to be on a panel on a very small film festival in Newcastle, which is north of Sydney. And I nearly wasn't going to do it. Then my husband said, oh, Newcastle's become quite arty. They've done all this stuff in the lanes, like Melbourne. And so, yeah, okay, why not? And there's some other really interesting filmmakers on the panel and so on. And then they contacted me and said, could you please do some publicity for our festival? I thought, oh, okay. So I'm on the local radio, Newcastle FM, talking about important to support local culture, go and see the festival. Last question is, what are you working on now? And I just mentioned, well, I'm doing a documentary about an unknown Australian costume designer, Orry-Kelly. Boom, hang up. The next day, I get an email to my agent from a lady who said, I work up and down the north coast of New South Wales, and I happened to be listening to Newcastle FM, and I heard your client, Gillian Armstrong, on radio, and she mentioned Orry-Kelly. And I actually know Orry-Kelly's grandniece. I don't know if Gillian would be interested in meeting her at all. And by the way, she has his memoir. We're like, what? So, but I've got to say, when we first turned up, she introduced me to Janet, Orry's great niece, and Catherine Thompson and I turned up, and there it was sitting on the kitchen table, but she brought the neighbours in because her son was the accountant and they're worried, Hollywood was coming and so on. And we were just desperate to grab it. I mean, I finally said, after about an hour of chat about documentaries, and yes, this is not Hollywood coming, you're not all going to be millionaires from us. I finally said, please, can I just read the first page? And then I was like, oh, I've got to read the last page. And then that one copy, we were so nervous about then, it was like, it's there. And they lived in 2 hours out of Sydney in quite a country area. And there were bushfires around that. And we're like, we've got to get them to get it copied. This is the one copy and we still haven't read it. So it was a process. And then we got them an agent. We said, why don't you have an agent look after you? We deal with them. And they'll explain to you that, you have this object, but it's not just something you sell to Sotheby's. It's actually, you can, sell some quotes for a documentary for us, but you could sell it to be a book, as it now is, and you could finally someone could make a movie from it. It could be a feature film. In the end, our film really was about a costume designer and who was he and what was it that made him great. I mean, we wanted a balance of the personal side, but in the end, it was finally about his work. I think the thing that I finally learned, it was interesting because in the beginning when we first started researching, I wasn't absolutely sure I wanted to do the film. Okay, won 3 Oscars. I had to actually feel, do I like his work? Do I think a film about his talent is worth telling? And then when I had the same attitude to Florence Broadhurst as well, the wallpaper designer. Someone approached me with that, I was like, a wallpaper designer? Anyway, but then I saw her incredible designs. It was so ahead of their time. And I felt in some ways the same about Orry. Once I looked at his work, looked at those films and really looked at the costumes, I went, oh, okay, no, this man really knows what he's doing. And then once I talked to all the historians, and once I, became an expert on costume myself, I would say, like Deborah Nadoolman Landis says in our film, he was a master of shape and silhouette and colour. He was an incredible tailor, which is interesting because he grew up next to a father that was a tailor, but he, as far as we know, he really wasn't making clothes and he was not trained. But I think the key to Orry was because in the beginning he wanted to be an actor and he loved theatre and the stage and storytelling. He always saw the costume from a story point of view and from the actor's point of view. And I think that's why Bette Davis really did use him as her right-hand man, because he was willing, as she was, to be really quite brave and say, this is about the character. This is not just about making you look like an incredible movie star all the way through. And Betty was very smart. She knew she wasn't the conventional movie star. She did have slightly odd looks. I mean, so there she was. She was in the hands of someone who had the skills to hide her flaws, like everybody has some flaws, and enhance aspects. But at the same time, the two of them went right out. I mean, when I first saw Mr. Skeffington, I thought, oh, God, the clothes look shocking in this. We won't put any clips from here. Then I read the whole story and saw the whole film and realised the clothes are meant to look shocking. This woman is meant to be vain, completely vain and full of herself. And as time went by, she became worse and was someone who was sort of chasing youth as it went. And so, yes, more and more frills are added, more and more makeup. So what he was doing, the two of them were doing, was telling a story that was right for the character. So in something like Dark Victory, at the beginning, when Betty's an incredibly wealthy and arrogant socialite, there's furs and really elegant cut, and complete change in the second half of the film when she's had her near-death shock with the brain tumour. She's fallen in love with the surgeon. I know it sounds corny, but I cried all the way through. And then it's about love, and she's just got like a check shirt, baggy trousers, living on the farm. And the final scene, the most emotional scenes in the film, she's just, plain shirt, plain skirt. I mean, the interesting thing about costume, and I know this as a director, people think that costume is, half the time they think the actors just turn up in what they want. They have no idea about, the hours and time that the director with the designer and then with the cast spend, deciding the simplest thing about should the button be done up or undone or the sleeve rolled up. What does that say at that moment in that character's life? And the wrong costume can ruin a scene or the film, or the wrong hair and makeup, because you're just distracted the whole time, or you're thinking, he'd never wear that, or she'd never wear that, or, a girl from the Bronx wouldn't have a coat like that. And so I think that's one of the key things about Orry. He was a great observer of humanity. The interesting thing is, this boy from the bush, as he called himself, boy from Kiama, in the end, he was designing and giving looks. He dressed women of all classes, so much so that people, women of a higher class who saw those films thought, oh, yes, maybe the white shirt is the way to go. So he could do the working class chorus girl in 42nd Street, or he could do the high end. And I think because of his theatre background, he also had a great understanding of period costume. Often costume designers can be good at one thing but not the other. And that's the other thing about Orry. She says, I feel like I'm doing the publicity campaign for Mr. Kelly. He had incredible range. And I like the fact that he fought. He fought to have things right. He would have had huge pressure from the studio. Number one, the leading lady should just look beautiful and look sexy. And romantic scenes, well, they've got to look romantic. So, it was interesting to read in his memoir and interviews. He was like, I'm not going to have love scenes with puff sleeves. that he fought against cliches. So we actually went through the movies. We put a montage in our film and of all the people kissing, and they weren't in floral and puff sleeves. And then he thought at the beginning, I want to be different to the others. And he did think that Hollywood had too much glitter, and so he thought, I'll start off and I'll be very, very simple. And the costumes he did for Kay Francis in all her early films, in those films of the 30s, and for Dolores Del Rio, are really beautiful and simple. And I think he worked that out with Betty as well, that just a really simple line was the best for her body. And so here we have, he has an understanding of what works for each actor and their individual body shapes. And then he loved history and he loved art, so he fought for authenticity. Now, we all think about the period films, the one set in the 50s, even though, it's Elizabeth II, they've all got rocker hair, she's got red lippy. I mean, he and Betty fought when they did Elizabeth. I mean, she did have her hair shaved back. Actually, I mean, if I was running the studio, I would have gone, maybe that is too severe. I think Betty said that in later life. But they had this huge fight then about the size of the hoops, which were enormous in Elizabethan times. And the director, Michael Curtiz, said, no, that's too much. And they were actually, as I think Deborah tells the story in my film, it was very, very naughty. Behind the director's back, how dare he did a set of hoops that they did all the tests for, and on the day when the poor director's so caught up in all the technical aspects of moving the camera and directing the extras, Betty just swans in the original size. So they're a bit naughty, but I love the fact that both of them sort of really fought for period authenticity. There's wonderful period clothes in Little Foxes as well with Betty, with amazing nets and hats and the whole shape. I mean, it's a thing that I still fight for in a period film as well. And to get a costume correct in a period film, it has to start from, well, what underwear did they wear? What corsetry? It won't feel correct unless you dress that poor actor in the exact corsetry or bras or whatever they wore at the time. That's when they'll really walk exactly like that person did in that era. And so he was really quite ahead of his time in fighting for period authenticity in those period films. Amongst the many articles that we found with Orry, there was one where he was talking about fashion. And he said, well, a costume designer can't be following fashion. We actually have to be ahead of fashion because, it's 6 months before the film comes out. And he said, my concept is that my clothes wrap around a form like smoke. And he said, if you do that, you will be ahead of your time. And it's an interesting statement because what exactly does he mean? I think perhaps, he definitely was someone who had incredible knowledge of fabric and how clothes moved and how they moved on camera. But I think he was also trying to say that very thing is you shouldn't notice. You should be in the film. You should only ever notice the costume if it's a major story point. So yes, if someone wears a red dress to a white ball, that dress is to be talked about and should be noticed. But in an ordinary conversation, what the costume should be saying is who I am or who I'm hiding or how I'm feeling this morning or if I'm in a rush or, my status, I'm poor, I'm very rich or I have no taste or I'm angry. They should say there's a whole language that our clothes carry about us that is subliminal, but an audience pick up on it. And the worst costumes are when they say, look at me, look at me. He's allowed to do look at me costumes if he's doing a musical. So yes, in Les Girls, they come out and you're meant to go, oh my God, or in The Dolly Sisters. But his dramas were the story matters and I'm here to serve the actor. My favourite costume in the exhibition would have to be Natalie's orange dress. Larry, the costume collector who owns it, he explained that Natalie, who had to play the greatest stripper of all time, was actually 5'2", quite boyish, quite flat-chested. And he explains how the costume gave her these incredible curves. The bra is completely padded out, but he also explains that the beading, that actually it curves out and gives her greater hips. And then the skirt has long lines, which gave her height. And I've now sat in the cinema and heard audiences, because I suppose some of that stuff I've taken for granted because, I've worked with some of the world's most amazing costume designers myself, and I've been in the room where we've been discussing, how do I make Claire Danes look smaller than Winona Ryder, because she's the little sister. So I know, a lot of the magic tricks that we can do with costume and camera. But I think that beautiful costume, and it's such a great, strong colour as well. So a minute I walked into the exhibition and saw it ahead of me, it felt like, oh, there's my friend. I've been extremely fortunate. I've actually worked with some of the world's greatest costume designers. Two of those are Australian, Luciano Righi, who designed My Brilliant Career, and Janet Patterson, who designed Oscar and Lucinda and The Last Days of Chez Nu. Lucci was nominated for My Brilliant Career, and Janet was nominated for The Piano. They're amongst the world's best. And also in my documentary, we interviewed Colleen Atwood, who did the costumes for me for Little Women, who does a lot of Tim Burton's films and has also won the Oscar a number of times. They are definitely considered amongst the world's best. So they, like Orry, approach with me and with the production designer and the director of photography. You come together early on and you're talking about the characters, and you're also talking about the colours too, and what mood and what subliminal feelings you want within the scene. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting, Janet was on Last Days of Chez Nu, Helen Garner's wonderful script. Janet was both sets and costume, because we were filming in a real house, but she was basically, we took it over and dressed it and painted it. And the key story is about two sisters and one who betrays the other. So the sisterhood was really important. And I actually invited Janet in just before I cast. We had Lisa Harrow cast, but before we cast Kerry Fox, I said, I want you to look at the two of them and say to me, can you help me make them look like sisters? And she said, well, I know the obvious thing is to give them the same colour hair, but she said, I think that will work for the story because they've both got very fair skin as well, and it'll suit them both. So we gave them auburn hair. Then Janet said, something that will help the audience continually think about the sisterhood, which is in this house, finally breaks apart. She said, I've got two sample colours for you for the wall colour, and they were like dark grey. I said, I'm not sure about that. Won't that be like sort of heavy and pull everything down? So we did tests with Jeffrey Simpson, our wonderful cinematographer. And what Janet thought, and she was correct, is that the dark wall both helped their auburn hair stand out and their blue eyes. And then she, in her dressing throughout their costume, quite often Kerry had a bright blue jacket on right from the very beginning. That also made her eyes jump out. And often Lisa was in a different tone of blue, and the background, the cushions, they were either, as I think Janet called them, jewel colours. So we had this colour palette that was to help you all the time think of red hair, blue eyes, red hair, blue eyes. So by the time this terrible betrayal happens, your heart is broken. And the thing that's interesting, so the jewel colours were like the same colour as the hair, orange, or there was red or purple or blue on the cushions or on the furniture. And I've run into people who said, that film, there was something haunting about it, something like the colour stayed with me. And I thought, thank you, Janet, you were right. people don't really think about, I mean, we are emotionally affected by colour. And I mean, there's another scene in Oscar and Lucinda with Kate Blanchett. When Kate and Ralph Fiennes, who plays Oscar, they have a scene where they make the key bet, which is about floating a glass church down a river. And they're in a cafe. And I talked early on to Janet and said, you know, I'm going to finally play a lot of this scene in big close-ups because it's so intense. They're sort of drawn into each other's worlds. I mean, Peter's Carey's great line is one's obsessive and the other's compulsive. So it's an obsessive and a compulsive. So what Janet did so cleverly, she has the most beautiful little hat on Kate that has a pale blue band. And she knew that in the end, my camera was going to come in like that. That hat is still just in the top of frame with that band, which is the absolute colour of Kate's eyes, which at that moment were really to become mad and obsessive, and was absolutely done by her the shape and the colour choice of the hat. I think for me that the exhibition here is such a wonderful finish. It's like all the pieces have come together. I mean, the dresses that we filmed, the drawings that we found, the quotes that Yolanda has chosen from the book and from her research. So often, actually, I'd pulled out the same quotes where, I mean, I thought, so I think, and then having the Oscars here, sitting properly lit in a row of 3, you think, walking into there, this is a solid legacy of a truly significant Australian artist, and how sad that he was nearly forgotten forever. And I feel very, very satisfied that all those pieces are there together, and they'll be there and on display for a number of months.